Our session is on net present value. We cover 6 topics. Net present value as an extension of present value, the net present value rule of investment decision making, the internal rate of return on an investment, which is also our second important financial function, IRR, net present value and internal rate of return as alternative investment decision-making tools, net present value and payment, where the PMT or payment function is the third important financial function, and the payback period of an investment. Recall from a previous session that present value equals the sum of discounted future cash flows. Here's the longhand version of the present value equation that we've been considering. And here's the shorthand version. Net present value is the sum of current and discounted future cash flows. NPV is an extension of present value to include the cash expended in year 0 that represents the initial investment in a new project or business line. Here's the NPV equation. Notice that we've added a new term, or we've added a term to the present value equation. Right here at the beginning, we now have C sub 0, which represents the initial cash outlay associated with getting a new project underway. So if we add the initial cash outlay to the sum of the discounted future cash flows, we get the NPV equation. Here's the shorthand version of the NPV equation. Notice that the only difference between this equation and the present value equation is that here we have the time series starting in year 0 rather than in year 1 and going out to the term of the project. NPV equals C sub 0 plus PV. So we still have a present value discounting calculation. To that, we're going to be adding the initial cash outlay. NPV can also be thought of as the initial investment, which is negative, plus future investment returns, which are typically positive. In capital expenditure or investment decision making, we're looking for business opportunities that have positive NPVs, or where present value is bigger than the initial cash outlay. We apply the NPV rule, which is that we accept investments or financing methods that have positive NPVs. As we'll see, such investments generate enough cash to cover their operating costs, to cover their financing costs, and to add value to the firm. And the net present value that's calculated equals the amount of value that a particular investment adds to the firm. Let's take an example of NPV. We want to know, what is the NPV of an investment opportunity that costs $300 and generates the following stream of cash flows? In year 1, $100, in year 2, $150, and in year 3, $165. And once again, our discount rate for this stream of cash flows is 7%. We're back to our working Excel file. I've labeled this worksheet NPV and IRR. In the upper left corner are the parameters that we're interested in. The discount rate is 7%, the term of the investment is 3 years, and the initial investment, now a new parameter, is $300. Over here we have our stream of cash flows over the years 0 through 3. For an NPV calculation, we need an initial cash outlay in year 0, which is our negative $300. And in years 1 through 3, we have the positive cash flows associated with starting this business. Now let's calculate our first NPV. I've already calculated the net present value to be $59.16. Let's see how I got this amount. We're going to invoke the function wizard, find the NPV function, and say yes, that's what we want. And the important point here is that we've been using the NPV function to calculate a present value. And now we're going to be using the NPV function to calculate a net present value. We start the same way we have been going. First of all, we have the rate, which is in cell B2. The cash flows for the NPV calculation are the same as the cash flows for the present value calculation within the argument. That is to say, we highlight the cash flows for years 1 through 3. Say OK. And notice what we've done is we've replicated our present value calculation for this stream of cash flows. Right now all we have is a present value of the stream of cash flows starting in year 1 and going out to year 3. To convert that present value amount into a net present value, we have to amend the NPV formula. So let's go up to the formula bar, click at the end of the NPV expression, and say plus, and now what we're going to do is to add the cash flow in year 0 to our present value calculation. Hit enter, and we have our NPV amount. An important point is that we use the NPV function to calculate both a present value and a net present value. The NPV function in Excel is actually a present value function. And to convert it to a net present value function, we have to do this little amendment to the NPV function and add in the cash flow in year 0. It's important when using the NPV function to calculate net present value that we don't highlight the cash flow starting in year 0 and going out to year 3 within the NPV function parameters, or parentheses. That's because the NPV function always reads the first cell in the parentheses as occurring at the end of the first year rather than at the end of year 0. And if it reads it as occurring at the end of the first year, it will discount it by dividing it by 1 plus r. And that would give us, if we allow that to happen, we would arrive at an incorrect net present value calculation. Let's talk a little bit about what this net present value of $59 means. We know that the present value of a stream of cash flows, this stream of cash flows that starts in year 1 and goes out to year 3, is $359. That's the positive return associated with this new business opportunity. But to undertake this new business opportunity, we have to spend $300 right away, or in year 0. So the net of our initial cash outlay and our returns for years 1 through 3 in present value terms is $59.16. Another interpretation of the $59.16 is that if we embark on this business opportunity, it will add $59.16 to the value of the firm. Another interpretation is that this project generates $59.16 more than it costs in present value terms. Now let's move to a new concept, internal rate of return. An investment generates a rate of return that can be compared to the discount rate. Here's the formula for the internal rate of return. In this formula, IRR is the unknown, and it can be found or calculated if we set the net present value formula equal to 0 and determine the rate of return that sets the initial cash outlay equal to the positive cash flows that start in year 1. Now, you're never going to have to calculate an IRR using this kind of formula. There is an IRR function in Excel that we're going to be using in just a minute. We could use an IRR investment decision rule, which says that we accept investments that offer rates of return in excess of the discount rate or our cost of financing. Let's look at an example of an IRR calculation. Going back to the previous business opportunity we've been evaluating, we want to know what is the rate of return on a business opportunity that costs us $300 and generates the following stream of cash flows. We're back to the spreadsheet where we've calculated the net present value of this business opportunity. And you can see right below the net present value I've calculated the internal rate of return. Now let's see how we can calculate IRR. Once again, we go to the function wizard, and now we're looking for a new financial function, IRR. Let's invoke the IRR function. The IRR function has really only one argument that you need to use, and that is the cash flows that start in year 0 and go out to the term of the project. So I'm going to highlight the cash flows starting in year 0 and going out through year 3. Say OK, and we get our internal rate of return calculated as 16.63%. An important heads up is that in using the IRR function, the cash flows within the parentheses start in year 0 and go out through the term of the project. That's in contrast to using the NPV function, where the cash flows within the parentheses start in year 1 and go out to the term of the project. Now let's talk about what this 16.63% IRR means. Implicit in this stream of cash flows, where we spend $300 in year 0 and we receive positive cash flows for the next 3 years, is that there is a 16.63% return on that investment. That's one interpretation. A second interpretation is that the rate of return on this investment of 16.63% is higher than our discount rate. That means, according to the IRR rule, that this investment is a good one. It's one that will add value to the firm because the rate of return on the investment exceeds the discount rate. Now I want to just clarify the distinction between an internal rate of return and a discount rate. The internal rate of return is specific to an investment opportunity. every investment opportunity will have an implicit rate of return that it earns. What we're doing is comparing that rate of return to the firm's cost of money, or the rate of interest that the firm has to pay to raise money, or the firm's discount rate. There is an important set of relationships between NPV and IRR. In the example we just covered on the Excel file, we had a situation where the net present value was a positive $59 and the internal rate of return was 16.63%. In that situation, we had a net present value that exceeded 0 and an internal rate of return that exceeded the discount rate. It's always going to be the case that if we have a business opportunity with a positive NPV, the rate of return on that business opportunity will exceed the discount rate. By extension, if we're looking at a business opportunity that generates a negative net present value, the rate of return on that project will be less than the discount rate. And finally, if the project has a 0 NPV, that is a project where the internal rate of return is exactly equal to the discount rate. However, sometimes when we're looking at more than one investment opportunity, and we look at the net present value and the IRR, we'll find that the investment with the highest net present value is not always the one with the highest internal rate of return. Let's look at an example today. Okay, we have a firm, Red Hen Proteins, and it's considering purchasing a turbo-powered egg carton machine for $4,000. The investment will generate cash flows of $2,000 in year 1 and $4,000 in year 2. And we want to know what is the internal rate of return on this investment. I've labeled this worksheet Red Hen IRR and indicated the stream of cash flows that we are interested in. The IRR on this stream of cash flows is 28%. Just for practice, let's see how I calculated that 28%. Once again, we go up to the function wizard, find the IRR function, bring it in, highlight the cash flows starting in year 0 and going out to the term of the project, and say OK. And we get our internal rate of return of 28%. To demonstrate the relationship between NPV and IRR, let's calculate the net present value of Red Hen's business opportunity at various discount rates. So I have discount rates down this column of 10%, 20%, 28%, and 40%. I won't bother to recalculate all of the net present values associated with these discount rates, but you can see what happens. When we have a discount rate, say of 10%, that's lower than our calculated IRR, we'll have a very positive net present value. When we have a discount rate that's somewhat higher but still lower than the internal rate of return, we have a positive but somewhat lower net present value. If we set the discount rate equal to the internal rate of return, we get a net present value of 0. And finally, if we have a discount rate that's 40% or in excess of the internal rate of return on the project, we get a negative net present value. The relationship between NPV and IRR that's represented in this business example is shown in this graph. On this axis we have net present value, and on this axis we have the discount rate, and the red line indicates the net present value for various discount rates. Right at 28%, is where the net present value is 0. We're right at a discount rate of 28% is where the net present value is 0. If we have lower discount rates, we have positive net present values increasing as we lower the discount rate towards 0. And as we increase the discount rate beyond 28%, we have negative net present values. Let's see how the NPV and IRR criteria can generate different rankings for two projects, mutually exclusive projects. Let's start with mutually exclusive projects that have the same lives or terms. And let's use an example of Argus Enterprises, which is comparing two retail outlets in the same market, one on Corky Street and one on Beanie Avenue. These investment opportunities are mutually exclusive because they're in the same market, and Argus Enterprises will be adopting only one of them, if one of them. I've labeled this worksheet Argus Enterprises, Mutually Exclusive Projects, Same Lives. Here's our discount rate of 10%. The cash flows for the two projects, Corky and Beanie, start in year 0 and go out for a term of 4 years. Corky requires an initial cash outlay of $23,616 and generates a return starting in year 1 of $10,000, which is consistent over the 4 years. The project Beanie also requires $23,616 in initial cash outlay, but this project generates no cash flow in year 1, only $5,000 in year 2, $10,000 in year 3, and $32,750 in year 4. If we calculate the net present values of these two projects, we find that the NPV of Corky is about $8,000, and the NPV for the project Beanie is over $10,000. And if we calculate the internal rates of return for these two projects, Corky generates an IRR of 25%, and Beanie generates an IRR of 22%. So comparing these two projects, we get different rankings depending upon the criterion we use. Applying the NPV criterion, Beanie looks like the preferred project. Applying the IRR criterion, Corky looks like the preferred project. Which criterion should we apply, and which project should we adopt? Before we get to that decision, let's discuss why these two criteria lead to different rankings. There are two essential reasons for the different rankings. The first has to do with the math underlying NPV and IRR. The NPV calculation assumes that the cash flows that occur in the early years of the project can be reinvested at the discount rate. The IRR function assumes that early cash flows that are spun off can be reinvested at the internal rate of return. The second reason for the different rankings has to do with the sequence of cash flows in Corky versus Beanie. You can see that the project Corky generates cash flows, good cash flows in years 1, 2, in the early years of the project, whereas to get good cash flows from Beanie, you have to wait really until years 3 and 4. Now let's put these 2 points together. Project Corky generates cash flows, good positive cash flows in years 1 and 2, and if it can be assumed that those cash flows can be reinvested at 25%, Corky's going to be looking better than Beanie. Beanie doesn't generate high cash flows in the first years, so doesn't really benefit much by a relatively high rate of return that can be earned by reinvesting the funds. So an investment decision criterion that assumes an opportunity for reinvestment at a very high rate naturally favors a project with early cash flows. And that's why Corky looks better according to the IRR criterion than Beanie. Is it more realistic to assume that early cash flows can be reinvested at the discount rate or at the rate of return? If it's the discount rate, then it's appropriate to look at the NPV calculation, and we can see that according to that criterion, the project Beanie looks preferred. If it's the internal rate of return, then it's appropriate to look at the IRR criterion, and we can see according to that criterion that Corky looks to be the preferred project. But which of those assumptions about opportunities for rates of return and reinvesting the funds is more realistic? Is it realistic to think that Argus can find other projects that generate 25%, which is really kind of a special rate of return particular to the Corky project, or that Argus in general is looking for projects that can generate returns somewhat higher than the discount rate? It's clearly more conservative to assume that interim cash flows can be reinvested at the discount rate than at the internal rate of return. And the convention is to make that assumption, that interim cash flows or early cash flows associated with a project can earn the discount rate or higher, not the internal rate of return in general. So the decision about which investment is best depends upon what is the appropriate discount rate or the true cost of financing. And just to review, the net present value calculation assumes that cash flows, interim cash flows, can be reinvested at the discount rate. The IRR criterion or math assumes that cash flows can be reinvested at the internal rate of return. And in general, finance theory holds that it's more appropriate to assume that the discount rate is available for the interim cash flow investment rather than the internal rate of return. There's one other important reason why the NPV function or the NPV criterion is preferred over the IRR criterion in choosing between mutually exclusive projects with the same lives. And that is because the NPV criterion focuses on cash generated by a project, and investors care about cash. Cash is what measures the extent to which investors have increased their wealth by making an investment. Investors aren't inherently interested in a high rate of return. You can use a rate of return as a decision criterion, but that's really not the objective. The objective of investors is to maximize cash, or specifically the net present value of cash. Some decision analytics situations involve evaluating projects with no positive cash flows. Typically, the analysis involves comparing competing technologies or competing ways of producing your product, competing ways of marketing your product that really have nothing to do with generating new business, new cash inflows, new revenues. So what we're doing is comparing maybe For example, one way of heating the building, which would involve renovation of a boiler, with another way of heating the building, which would involve purchasing a whole new boiler. So we have two different ways of doing business, or doing a particular function in our business, and in this situation there are no additional revenues. So how do we compare two projects, neither of which generates additional revenues or additional business, additional cash inflow? The decision analysis is to calculate the present value of costs, or the present value of cash outflows, associated with these two businesses, associated with these two competing technologies, and the criterion is to minimize the net present value of the costs, or to minimize the negative net present value of these two technologies. The point is, we have to adopt one of the technologies, or we have to make one of these investments. Which one of them costs us less in present value terms? In looking at investments in new technologies, it's important to note that while these two technologies maybe don't generate new business, they can generate some positive cash flows in terms of the tax effects, or the tax shields that are generated by their investments. In our previous slides, we saw how when we compare two or more mutually exclusive projects with the same lives, we select the project with the highest net present value generally. Or if we're comparing two mutually exclusive projects that have no positive cash flows, we select the project with the smallest negative NPV. Here let's consider comparing two or more mutually exclusive projects with different economic lives. In comparing these projects, you must account for the time it takes to achieve a given net present value. Let's look at a very simple example. Wahoo Products is considering two new brands, Tippy and Casey. Tippy generates a net present value of $100 over 4 years. Casey generates a net present value of $200, but it takes 10 years to achieve. Both of these projects have been evaluated using a discount rate of 6%. To compare these two projects, we need to calculate the net present value created per year. That is, we want to calculate the annualized NPV, which is equal to the net present value divided by a factor that actually annualizes that net present value and helps us to determine the net present value created per year. That factor is called an annuity factor. I've labeled this worksheet Wahoo Products, Mutually Exclusive Projects, Different Lives. Here's our discount rate. And note that what I've already done is to calculate the net present values of the two investment alternatives, Tippy and Casey. And here they are, $100 and $200 respectively. I've also indicated the term of the two projects, 4 years for Tippy and 10 years for Casey. Finally, I've calculated the annualized net present values for the two projects. And now I'm going to delete those numbers and show you how to calculate an annualized net present value. To calculate an ANPV, we're going to use the third important financial function in Excel. So let's go up to the function wizard. And the function we're interested in is PMT, which, as you can see, says it calculates the payment for a loan based on constant payments and a constant interest rate. We are going to use the PMT function when we get into loan amortization later on in the course. But the PMT function can also be used to convert a net present value into an annualized net present value, or net present value generated per year. So we say, okay, that's the function we want. Now our rate in the payment function is the discount rate we use to calculate the NPVs, and that's our 6%. So I highlight that cell reference, and I'm going to hit the F4 key to lock the cell reference because we're going to want to be able to use that again without having the cell change. Second argument in the PMT function is the number of periods over which the net present value is generated. And for project TIPI, that's 4, so I highlight that cell. The last argument we need in the PMT function is a present value, which is actually the net present value we've already calculated. Now I'm going to put a minus sign in here first. And I'll describe why I did that a little bit later, and then I'm going to highlight the amount, the cell that indicates the net present value of TIPI. Say OK, and you can see I've calculated the annualized net present value for the project TIPI. Now because I locked the discount rate cell reference, I can put the crosshairs at the southeast corner and drag that calculation over, and we get the annualized net present value for Casey. Okay, first I want to explain why I needed the negative sign before the net present value amount. That's just because in the math of the PMT function, the assumption is that the cash is flowing kind of in a negative fashion. And so I wanted to get rid of what would come up as a negative annualized NPV by putting a negative sign in front of the NPV function, the NPV dollar amount. We'll come back to that explanation somewhat later when we... Okay, now let's look at the interpretation of the annualized net present values for TIPI and Casey. The ANPV for TIPI is $28.86, which means that that project generates that amount of money, $28.86 per year for 4 years in present value terms. Casey generates $27.17 per year for 10 years in present value terms. So on a per year basis, TIPI is the preferred project because it generates more cash in present value terms per year than Casey. The annualized net present value calculation is one of, let's say, 2 or 3 common approaches to evaluating 2 or more mutually exclusive projects with different economic lives. And it's the one we're going to be using in this course. We've covered the 2 criteria most commonly used in investment decision analysis, that is the net present value and internal rate of return criteria. There's one more approach that is sometimes used in determining whether to go forward with a new business opportunity, and that's the payback period. The payback period of a project is the number of years it takes before the cumulative forecasted cash flows exceeds the initial outlay. That is, it's the number of years it takes for the investor or the firm that's making the investment to recoup the money that it's made, that it's invested in the initial period. The payback rule says that we're going to accept projects that pay back within a particular desired time frame. Often firms will establish payback period criteria where they will say we're only going to invest in projects that pay us back our initial cash outlay within 3 years, 5 years, or 10 years. And so the rule is we're going to accept projects that pay back within that particular time frame. Financial economists consider the payback period approach, to be essentially flawed for 2 reasons. First, it ignores cash flows that occur after the payback period. And second, it doesn't account for the present value of cash flows. Let's consider an example. We have 3 projects, and we want to see the problems that might arise if we use the payback period as our decision criterion. So each project requires an initial cash outlay of $2,000. One project generates $500 in each of the first 2 years and $5,000 in the third year. And you can see the time series of the cash flows for the other two projects. One is kind of loaded at the second year, and a third is loaded at the first year in terms of the cash flows. Now let's calculate the payback period for these three projects. Project A requires 3 years to recoup the initial cash outlay. Project B requires 2 years, and Project C requires 2 years. So according to the payback period criterion, projects B and C look equivalent, and both of them look to be superior to Project A. But if we were to calculate the net present value of these three projects at a discount rate of 10%, Project A is by far the superior project, generating $2,600 in NPV. Project B has a negative NPV, and Project C has a small positive NPV. Now, we get a wacky ranking using the payback period criterion because, first of all, that criterion ignores all these or most of these positive cash flows that occur, let's say, after a 2-year payback period cutoff. So by ignoring the $5,000 that occurs in year 3, we don't reflect the fact that we have a significant advantage to Project A. Second, in terms of the problems with the payback period criterion, is that it ignores the timing of cash flows even within the payback period and results in an equal ranking of projects B and C, even though now that you know about the time value of money, you can easily see that Project C is superior to Project B because the cash flows in the first year rather than in the second year, by and large. While the payback period criterion has these essential flaws as a standalone criterion, sometimes firms use the payback period as a supplementary criterion to the NPV or IRR criteria in helping them make their decisions to invest capital. These firms might take the view, we will invest in new business opportunities with positive NPVs as long as they have payback periods of 5 years or shorter. When used in this way, the payback period criterion is essentially a risk reduction approach. Essentially, these firms are saying we don't have confidence that we can project cash flows beyond 5 years. We feel fairly confident about being able to predict what might happen in the next 5 years, so we're only going to be embarking on new opportunities if they generate positive NPVs within, let's say, a 5-year investment decision horizon. Some firms like to calculate the payback in present value terms. Essentially what they do is to calculate a running net present value as a project goes along over time to see what is the net present value in each year as the project proceeds. So for example, we might want to ask the question, how many years does a project generating $200,000 per year in cash flow take to return an initial investment of $1 million in present value terms if our discount rate is 8%? I've labeled this worksheet Payback Period using present values. Here's the sequence of cash flows. We have a project with a 9-year term. I ran this one out for 9 years. Here's our initial cash outlay of $1 million and our positive cash returned of $200,000 per year for 9 years. Now what we're interested in is what's called a running net present value. We want to know what is the net present value at the end of each year starting in year 1. So let's see how to calculate this running net present value column. You can see that I've calculated. I'm going to highlight it, delete it, and show you how to calculate it. The first thing we want to do is to invoke the NPV function. Okay, and we have a discount rate of 8%. I'm going to violate my rule and actually just enter the 8% as a hard number. Our values, in this case, we want to know the net present value at the end of the first year, so the only value we highlight is the $200,000 for year 1. Say OK. And then, as you recall, to calculate a true net present value, we have to go up to the formula bar and modify our formula by adding back in the year 0 cash flow. And for the first year, at the end of the first year, the NPV is a minus $800,000. Now let's see how to fill in this running NPV column fairly quickly. To do so, we need to modify our NPV function a bit. First, we want to lock this B4, this initial B4 cell reference, by hitting F4. And we want to lock the B3 cell reference by hitting F4 in front of it. And we want to tell the computer that we're interested in the cash flows beginning in year 1 and going out for 2 years, going out for 3 years, going out for 4 years. That is, we want the computer or this NPV function to sort of read that we want kind of sequentially to add another year into the cash flow stream. And the way we do that is to just say period and then hit B4 again. And what we've done for the first year is to say we're interested in the net present value of the cash flows from B4 to B4, adding back in the cash flows in B3, and I think we've got our cell references locked properly, so we can now take the running net present value calculation for year 1 and drag that calculation down all the way to year 9. And we get our running NPV calculation. I'll let you play around with how I did that to get comfortable with it and just kind of focus now on the interpretation. This running NPV column shows the net present value generated by this new project after each of the years that the project is in force. So after 1 year, we're still in the hole by $800,000. After 2 years, we've gotten a little bit out of the red, but we're still losing $643,000 in present value terms. It takes us all the way to year 7 to generate sufficient cash flow, future cash flow, to cover our initial cash outlay. And then if the project lasts 9 years, we have a nice about $250,000 positive NPV. Okay, this last slide in this session describes the relative frequency with which CFOs employ the decision criteria that we've covered in this session. As you can see, about 3/4 of CFOs generally require calculation of a net present value to evaluate a new investment opportunity. About the same number require the calculation of the internal rate of return. Now, as I've argued in this session, NPV is essentially the superior criterion if we're looking at mutually exclusive projects. It's a criterion that I argue is superior kind of in general, And so I recommend always calculating the net present value. But it's typically of interest to calculate the internal rate of return as well on a new business opportunity. So what I typically do is to calculate both the net present value and the internal rate of return on an investment opportunity, but to use the NPV as the principal criterion for making the decision.